Right, I have with me a very special guest, the CIO of Oppenheimer Funds, joining me from New York. Mr. Krishna Memani is on the phone line with us. Mr. Memani, great to have you on the show. Thanks very much for speaking to us exclusively on this historic occasion, because a historic reform has been passed in the floor of the House. Now, how does GST change the reform perception of, for India? Essentially, now two key bills in the bankruptcy code and GST have seen the light of the day. What does that mean for the reform story in India?
So India has always had the potential to grow at a very rapid clip. However, the execution that was needed for it to realize its potential was always in doubt for international investors. I think what the GST bill and the bankruptcy bill proved to people is the fact that from a political standpoint and from a desire to move the country forward from a structural reform standpoint, we are not just talking about things. We are walking the talk as much. We are actually going out and implementing those things, which are politically tough, but the current government has the political power and the desire to make those changes, and those are coming about. So that's a very, very positive statement for the state of affairs in India.
Oh, yes, indeed. And GST is a global best practice when it comes to having a uniform tax rate for the entire nation. Now, could you give us anecdotal evidence on how this has really worked for other countries, and that's why it's important for India? I think the range for other countries has been between 15 to 16%, and in India, they're talking about a benchmark of 18%. As a foreign investor, how much do the numbers or the benchmark rate really matter? Because sentimentally, here in India, they're saying if it is anywhere above 18%, then that would be a sentiment dampener.
So I think the actual number is far more dependent on local conditions than it is in an international context. That is, it really has more to do with what the tax base is in a particular economy and what the net revenue impact would be of any of those things. Having said that, I think what the government has to be careful with is to make sure that a GST bill doesn't become onerous for certain parts of the economy. The small-scale sector of the Indian economy may suffer a great deal if the GST levels end up being significantly higher than 18%. But I think the key thing for an international investor is not the number itself. It's really the fact that for the first time, basically since 1990s, India is taking concrete structural steps to make it in a more 21st century economy than a 20th century economy.
That's right. However, on the flip side, if one were to just look at the impact of GST, now there's a short-term impact, there's a long-term impact. Do you think that investors such as yourself will look at the legislation and its contribution to India's GDP over the long term, or would you also in the interim be worried about the implementation process, which could mean ballooning of the expenditure side of the deficit number? There could be bumps in setting up the infrastructure. Or do you think that this is really a long-term process? This is a long-term legislation, so there's no harm in the short-term difficulties or impediments that one faces?
I think for long-term investors, we would cut the Indian economy and the Indian markets a bit more slack with this bill in place, even if the deficit increases. Again, that's not a blanket statement, but I think foreign investors perhaps would be more accommodating if they see these types of structural reforms that have a long-term impact, even if they lead to some level of impact in the near term. Having said that, that impact cannot be overwhelming so that you never realize the longer-term benefit. But I think long-term investors think about things in a long-term way, and this is definitely a long-term positive, even if it leads to some difficulty in the near term.
Okay, and now India as a market has done very well, and you've been buying, you've been very bullish on the Indian market among emerging markets as such. With GST and the possibility of more rate cuts coming in under the new RBI regime with the MPC model, would India become a compelling buy?
India actually has been a compelling buy for investors, but for slightly different reason, which is India has been a compelling buy because the political risk and the monetary policy risk in India has been much lower than their competitors in the EM world, and as a result, India really has been a safe destination for emerging market flows out of developed markets. Indian valuations are quite rich to be sure, but I think what these structural reforms kind of tell us investors is the fact that the valuations may be rich today, but the longer-term story is improving materially for us to stick with it for the long term.
Okay, and where would the GST bill clearance pave the way for more investment from funds such as yourself? FMCG is expensive, but there's a definite growth in that sector. Logistics has had a decent run, mining, infrastructure, banks. Where would you perhaps look at more investment in lieu of this reform?
The way we approach it is not necessarily because GST bill will have a particular impact on the sector. It's really more about finding good companies that we feel have the best business strategy, irrespective of the sector that they are in an environment where the overall economy grows at a much faster rate. So it's really going out and partnering with large brands, large companies, small companies in India that we believe have the best growth trajectory, which will be helped by these types of structural reforms. More that than sector-specific impact.
Sure, but I think it does help the overall sentiment, like you just alluded to. What has been your India position among emerging markets? I know you're more optimistic about India and its profile as an investment destination. Would this reform becoming a reality make you increase your holdings in India? Would you be a buyer in Indian equities, Indian bonds, the currency, which has been very resilient, and you've particularly highlighted the gains it's made this month?
Sure. So we have been a very long-term investor in India. We have been an investor in India when India wasn't fashionable. We have a very significant position, an overweight position relative to our benchmarks in India. The long-term trajectory for India is changing. We look at the fixed income markets in India, and we find them quite attractive as well. So India overall for us is becoming more and more attractive, and these types of structural reforms, despite all the other political news stories, kind of makes us very hopeful.
Mr. Memani, thanks very much for taking out the time to speak with us today over this short phone interview.
Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/ETNow, and don't forget to click the like button. You can also follow us on Twitter at ETNowLive. To stay updated with all our programming, hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel by logging on to youtube.com/user/ETNow.